Julia was willing to plunge into hell as long as she could be with Matteo. The problem? Matteo was the demon guarding the gates of that mafia hell, swearing that the woman he loved would never set foot in them, even if that meant he had to be alone in there. Soft morning sunlight filtered through the thin curtains, waking Julia. For a moment, she felt incredibly comfortable. A solid warmth surrounded her, a masculine scent that was unfamiliar yet soothing. She realized her arm was draped over something large and warm, and her cheek was resting against a chest that rose and fell in a steady rhythm. Her eyes snapped open. She had been hugging Matteo in her sleep. Panic stung her instantly. She pulled herself away as fast as lightning, her heart pounding. She stared at Matteo, who was still sound asleep, his face looking peaceful, unlike the monster she usually saw. Julia sat on the edge of the mattress, catching her breath. Strangely, beneath the panic, another feeling lingered. A feeling of safety. She shook her head, dismissing the thought, and tiptoed to the small kitchenette to make coffee. The strong aroma of coffee finally woke Matteo. He groaned softly, opening his heavy eyes. For a moment he was confused, seeing the low, cracked ceiling instead of the high, carved ceiling of his villa. Then his memory returned. The stormy night, his long confession, this narrow mattress. He sat up, wincing slightly at his ribs, then saw Julia in the kitchen. His signature crooked smile slowly reappeared. He got up and walked silently toward Julia. Julia was pouring hot water when she felt a pair of arms wrap around her waist from behind. She tensed. "Morning, Tesoro," Matteo whispered in her ear, his chin resting on her shoulder. Matteo waited for her usual reaction, an elbow to the gut, a scolding or a frantic attempt to break free. He expected her to push him away as usual, but Julia didn't. She just averted her eyes, focusing on the black swirl in the coffee cup. "Good morning," she murmured softly. Matteo paused for a moment, surprised. No resistance? A sly smirk blossomed on his lips. If Julia wanted to play tame, he would play wilder. He tightened his embrace, pulling Julia's back flush against his broad chest. "You slept so soundly last night," he teased, his voice low and full of implication. "You really couldn't keep your hands off me, could you? I thought my ribs would break again from your tight hug." Julia's face turned bright red. "It was an accident. I was cold, of course." Matteo chuckled, his nose nuzzling Julia's neck. "But I have to admit, this bed of yours, it's very comfortable, especially with both of us in it. Feels like we should sleep together like this more often." He deliberately emphasized the words "sleep together," with a tone that made the meaning ambiguous, as if they had just done more than merely sleep. "Stop it," Julia squeaked, mortified but still not moving away. Matteo chuckled, enjoying the blush on Julia's cheeks. He was just about to tease her again when, bang, 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 the front door of the trattoria downstairs was banged on loudly and frantically. The intimate mood shattered instantly. Matteo immediately released Julia, his entire posture shifting to alert. He walked quickly to the window, peering down. It was his bodyguard, his face pale with panic. Matteo cursed softly. He knew that look. It wasn't just panic because he had disappeared overnight. It was panic from a major crisis. He grabbed his shirt draped over a chair, putting it on quickly without fully buttoning it. "Wait here," he commanded Julia, his tone cold and serious again. He rushed down the stairs, unlocking the trattoria door. Julia peeked from the upstairs window. She saw Matteo talking to the bodyguard. She couldn't hear what they were saying, but she saw Matteo's jaw clench and his fists tighten. Something bad had happened. Julia waited at the top of the stairs, her heart pounding. She heard the door slam shut downstairs, followed by rapid footsteps coming up. Matteo returned, but the man who had just teased her in bed was gone. In front of her now was the capo. Feared by everyone in Rome, his face was hard as granite, his eyes cold and focused on something distant and dangerous. He was buttoning his shirt with quick, efficient movements. He didn't meet Julia's eyes as he snatched a receipt paper from a small table and a pen. He scribbled a series of numbers roughly. "Take this," he said, shoving the paper into Julia's hand. His voice was sharp, leaving no room for argument. "Matteo, what's wrong?" Julia asked, fear creeping up her throat. Matteo didn't answer her question. He gripped Julia's shoulders, his gaze finally locking onto hers. The intensity in his eyes made Julia hold her breath. "Listen carefully," Call this number if anything happens. Anything at all. If you see any suspicious strangers, if anyone asks about me, call this number immediately. But don't leave this alley," he interrupted, his grip tightening slightly. "Stay inside the trattoria. Lock all the doors after I leave. Understand?" Julia could only nod, too afraid to ask anything else. Matteo looked at her for a second longer, as if he wanted to say something else, but held back. Instead, he did something surprising. He pulled Julia close and kissed the top of her head. A quick, hard, fiercely protective kiss. It wasn't a seductive kiss. It was the kiss of a man saying goodbye before going to war. "Take care of yourself," he whispered gruffly. Without waiting for a reply, he turned and went down the stairs, his steps heavy and fast. Julia heard the trattoria's front door open, then the sound of a car engine roaring, to life and tires screeching on wet asphalt. As the car sped away, the silence he left behind was deafening. Julia stood alone in her small apartment, still clutching the paper with the phone number. Matteo's still steaming coffee cup sat on the table, the only proof he had ever been there. She didn't know what had happened, but she knew one thing. Matteo's dark world had just pulled him back in, and she didn't know when or if he would return. The first day passed slowly. Julia constantly glanced at the door, hoping the bell would ring and Matteo would walk in with his crooked smile, asking for pappardelle as if nothing had happened. But he didn't come. On the second day, Julia started jumping at the sound of every car at the end of the alley. She slept with her phone clutched in her hand, the number Matteo gave her already saved on speed dial. A week passed. Then 2 weeks. The small trattoria felt empty. Regular customers still came, praising her cooking, but for Julia, it felt like there was a gaping hole in the corner of the room, right at the table where Matteo used to sit. Worry began to gnaw at her like a disease. She remembered Matteo's story that night, about betrayal, about the violence that was his daily bread. Her imagination ran wild. Was he hurt again? Was it worse this time? Was he dead? The thought made her breathless. She tried calling the number Matteo gave her once, on the 10th silent night. The phone rang for a long time, then went to voicemail. She didn't leave a message. She tried to keep herself busy. She opened the trattoria earlier and closed it well past midnight. She even started serving a few drunk customers. She would usually kick out at 2 a.m, just hoping that, maybe, Matteo would come looking for sanctuary again in those quiet hours. But the alley remained empty. Her fear slowly shifted. At first, she was afraid of Matteo. Now she was afraid for Matteo. She realized how deeply the man had infiltrated her life. He was no longer just the monster who coerced her. He was the monster who had shown her his wounds, and now that monster was gone. Every night, before sleeping on the mattress that now felt too big and cold, she would stare out the window at the dark streets of Rome, praying to a God who might no longer listen to prayers for men like Matteo, that he was safe. It was an ordinary Tuesday, 3 weeks after his departure. The trattoria was quiet during the late lunch hour. The doorbell jingled. Julia, who was listlessly wiping down a table, looked up. Her heart felt like it stopped, then raced wildly. 2 large bodyguards entered first, taking positions near the door. And behind them, stepping in with an aura that made the room feel smaller, was Matteo. He was alive. He looked tired. There were darker circles under his eyes, and he looked a little thinner, his cheekbones more prominent. But he stood tall, wearing an impeccable charcoal gray suit, radiating the same power as before. His eyes found Julia's instantly. The relief that hit Julia was so strong her knees felt weak. She had to hold onto a table to keep from falling. She wanted to cry. She wanted to scream at him for disappearing. But most of all, she was just glad he was there. Matteo walked to his corner table. He sat down slowly, as if his body was still sore. Julia took a deep breath, wiped her eyes quickly before tears could fall, and grabbed her notepad. She walked to his table, her feet feeling light. "Welcome back, signore," she said. She tried to sound professional, but her voice trembled and a wide, genuine smile broke across her face that she couldn't hold back. Matteo stared at that smile for a moment, stunned. It wasn't a fearful smile, not a forced, polite smile. It was a real welcoming smile. The corner of his lips lifted into his familiar, crooked smile. "I'll have the usual, tesoro," he said, his voice warm like strong espresso. Julia rushed to the kitchen. She cooked with a passion that had been missing for so long. When she brought the pappardelle back, she placed it carefully in front of Matteo. still wearing the same smile. Matteo didn't eat immediately. He reached out and touched Julia's hip as she stood by his table. "That smile is new," he teased softly. "Did you save it especially for me?" Usually, Julia would brush his hand away and leave. But today she didn't move. She let his hand stay there, feeling its real warmth. "Maybe," Julia replied boldly, meeting his eyes. "Or maybe I'm just happy my best customer is finally back to pay his tab." Matteo chuckled softly, a sound that made Julia's stomach flutter. "Ah, so it's just about the money?" He stroked her hip gently with his thumb. "I bet you missed me more than just my wallet, Julia." Julia didn't deny it. She couldn't. The relief of seeing him alive was too great to hide behind pretense anymore. Matteo's smile widened at Julia's newfound boldness. He felt the shift. Julia's defensive walls had crumbled while he was gone. "I know you missed me terribly," he said, his tone low and full of intoxicating confidence. He pulled Julia's hip a little closer, forcing her to lean slightly toward him. "You can't live without me, can you?" It was the kind of arrogant teasing he usually threw around. He expected Julia to roll her eyes or deny it with a flushed face. But Julia did neither. She looked straight into Matteo's dark eyes. Her smile faded, replaced by a raw, vulnerable honesty. "True," she whispered. "As it is now, I can't live without you." Matteo froze. The teasing vanished from his face. "That's why," Julia continued, her voice gaining strength. "Take me with you." Matteo's face instantly hardened. The cold capo mask snapped back into place, shutting out all the warmth that had just been there. He released Julia's hip as if he'd been burned. "No," he said sharply. "Why not?" Julia demanded. "You disappeared for 3 weeks. I didn't know if you were dead or alive. I don't want to wait here in the dark anymore." Matteo stood up, towering over her. "You don't understand what you're asking. Julia, my world is not a place for you. It's dark. It's dirty. It's full of blood and people who would kill you just to hurt me."
"I don't care!"
"I care!" Matteo snapped. "I did all this, staying away from you, cleaning up the mess, so you could stay clean, so you could stay safe here." "Safe?" Julia laughed bitterly. "I didn't feel safe when you were gone. I felt dead." "Enough," Matteo said coldly, turning to leave. "Miss," a voice interrupted. Julia and Matteo turned. One of the bodyguards standing near the door had spoken. He looked uncomfortable under Matteo's sharp glare, but he continued anyway. "You don't know what happened yesterday," the bodyguard said, looking at Julia earnestly. "We were ambushed, a 2-hour firefight. We almost died just to hold this territory." He pointed at Matteo, whose jaw was clenched tight. "Boss hasn't slept. He hasn't eaten properly. The only thing keeping him sane was knowing you were safe here. He loves you very much. Miss, he's terrified you'll die if you get too close to him." Julia was stunned. She looked at Matteo again. Behind that cold mask, she could now see the genuine fear in his eyes. Fear not for himself, but for her. Julia's heart melted. She wanted to argue again, wanted to scream that she could take care of herself. But she saw Matteo's shoulders slump slightly as his bodyguard finished speaking. Matteo's expression softened as he looked back at Julia. It was a look of pleading he rarely showed. "Please," he said softly, his voice hoarse. "Don't ask me to destroy the only good thing I have by bringing it to hell with me." Silence enveloped the small trattoria after the bodyguard's confession. Matteo let out a long sigh, as if the weight of the world had just been placed back on his shoulders. He stepped closer to Julia again, taking both her hands gently. "I need you to stay here, Julia," he whispered, the honesty in his eyes so naked it hurt to look at. "When I'm out there, when everything is dark and full of blood, I need to know there's one place in this world that's still bright." He lifted Julia's hands, kissing her knuckles. "This trattoria, your warm cooking, your face when you're angry at me, that is my light. If I take you with me, that light will go out. I will destroy it." Julia swallowed, tears welling up in her eyes. She understood now. She wasn't just a woman he wanted. She was his anchor to sanity. "So, I just have to wait?" she asked hoarsely. "Not just wait," Matteo said firmly. Live well for me." He released one hand to reach into his jacket pocket, pulling out a thick envelope. "I've bought this building in your name, officially. No more rent, no more debts." He placed the envelope in Julia's hand. "Whatever you need, the best supplies, renovations, extra staff, just say it. I will provide it. Money is not an issue." Julia stared at the envelope. It felt heavy, This makes me feel like a mistress, she whispered, voicing her biggest fear, that she was just a paid escape. Mateo lifted her chin, forcing her to meet his eyes. Don't ever think that, he said intensely. This isn't payment, Julia. This is protection. This is my way of making sure the only precious thing I have never lacks anything. Let me do this for you, please. Julia saw the profound seriousness on his face. She remembered the stories of his dark childhood, of the merciless world he lived in. This man didn't know how to love normally. He loved by protecting, by providing materially, by controlling the environment to make it safe. If Julia rejected this, she was rejecting the way Mateo loved her. She took a deep breath, looking into the eyes of this dangerous man who had stolen her heart. If being his light meant staying here, then she would shine as brightly as possible for him. Okay, Julia said softly. I accept. Mateo let out a sigh of relief, the tension in his shoulders disappearing. He pulled Julia's hand to his lips again, this time kissing her palm with deep reverence. Thank you, he whispered. He then turned and went back to his table, sitting down as if the weight of the world had been lifted from him. He began to eat his slightly cooled pappardelle with renewed appetite. After a few bites, he paused. He looked over at Julia, who was still standing nearby. My hand is still a bit stiff from yesterday's events, he said, a blatantly false excuse considering how he had just gripped Julia's shoulders earlier. He grinned petulantly. Feed me? Julia rolled her eyes, but she couldn't suppress a small smile. She walked over, taking the fork from his hand. You are a really big baby, Signora Viteri, she grumbled playfully, feeding the pasta into his mouth. From near the door, there was a choking sound. One of the bodyguards, the one who had spoken earlier, stared at them, with wide eyes in disbelief. Really, boss? He whispered to his partner, but loud enough to be heard. In front of us? Mateo swallowed his food, then shot a sharp look at his men with one eyebrow raised. Why? He asked casually. Aren't you used to seeing me having segs? Or shooting people? Feeding me pasta shouldn't be too shocking. Julia almost dropped her fork. Mateo! She hissed, her face burning bright red. Mateo just chuckled. What? It's true, isn't it? Julia swallowed. She knew it was true. She knew who Mateo was. A mobster couldn't be naive. He must have done terrible things, slept with many women, probably even killed people in front of his men. The reality hit her again, but this time, she chose to accept it. She took a breath, squared her shoulders, and fed the next bite into Mateo's mouth a little more firmly. The bodyguard shook his head, still amazed. We are used to seeing Boss with other women, he admitted honestly. But seeing this, it feels different, miss. He watched how Mateo looked at Julia as he chewed, a gaze that was soft, attentive, without a shred of his usual savagery. It looks genuine, the bodyguard continued. Like real love, not just, well, you know. Julia smiled amusedly at the awkward analysis from the large-armed man. Mateo wasn't angry. Instead, he looked at Julia, his gaze intense and serious. It is, he said loudly, his voice filling the small room with unwavering certainty. We do love each other. The confession hung in the air, heavy and real. Julia felt her face heat up, not from embarrassment this time, but from the naked truth of it. She looked away, unable to meet the intensity in Mateo's eyes or the knowing smirks of the bodyguards. So, Mateo said, breaking the silence with a sudden business-like tone. He pushed his empty plate away. We've agreed on the building. What else do you need? A stock of white truffles? A new espresso machine from Milan? Just say it. He was back in provider mode, trying to show his love the only way he fully mastered, materially. Julia looked at the man before her. His slightly rumpled expensive suit, the dark circles under his eyes showing deep exhaustion, and the hands that had done terrible things to keep her safe. She didn't need luxury items. She didn't need truffles. I need you, Julia said softly, looking straight into his eyes. Now, Mateo paused, a little taken aback by the honesty of her request. His capo mask cracked completely, replaced by naked desire. Without warning, he stood up, pulled Julia by the waist until she collided with his body, and kissed her. A deep, hungry kiss, full of long-suppressed possessiveness. Hem! A loud clearing of throats came from the door. The two bodyguards were looking resolutely at the ceiling, one of them muttering, Please, boss, we're still here. Mateo released Julia's lips, but not her body. They both chuckled, a light, intimate laugh in the midst of their heavy world. You two, guard outside, Mateo ordered, his eyes never leaving Julia's face. "Make sure no one disturbs us until tomorrow morning. And I mean anyone." "Yes, boss." They replied in unison, rushing out and closing the trattoria door quickly. Matteo looked at Julia, his crooked smirk returning. "You heard that? We have until morning." He took Julia's hand, leading her toward the stairs, behind the kitchen that led to the small apartment above. "Let's go," he said. Julia followed him. Every step up those stairs was a confirmation of her choice. She knew who Matteo was. She knew the blood on his hands. She knew the danger lurking outside her trattoria door. But as Matteo opened the door to her apartment and looked at her with a mix of vulnerability and love he only showed her, Julia knew she was exactly where she belonged. She was the mafia boss's escape, and she would be the best hiding place he ever had. The end.